everyone. Welcome back to another exciting edition of the Geo Trip. I am very happy to be back with my favorite co-host, who's back out of retirement, and our exciting guest today, who is going to be talking to us about climate change, and also climate refugees. So I'm going to swing it away to Dr. Prince to get us started.
Marjahn Finlayson is a Bahamian researcher who studies tropical cyclones and climate, both change and variability. She's at the Cape Eleuthera Institute at the Island School, and she has introduced atmospheric sciences while working on a new partnership with the University of Miami and NOAA to improve hurricane predictions. As a self-proclaimed planeteer, she is passionate about working in science education and mentorship for Black STEM majors, especially for women, non-binary, and Caribbean folks.
Well, welcome, Marjahn. Feel free to jump in at any time and just kind of take us on your journey. I mean, here at the Geo Trip, we like to begin our discussion by asking our guests, what got you here? What got you interested in climate and, I guess, atmospheric science on a whole?
Oh, yes, absolutely. First, let me just say thank you both for having me. I'm so humbled and happy to be with you guys talking about this. So I got involved in climate and atmospheric science. Basically, I started off my interest in hurricanes, right? Because I grew up in the Bahamas and I watched the Weather Channel with my father every hurricane season, and we became kind of like paranoid together. And of course, why not grow into the paranoia and study hurricanes, right? So what happened was, like younger, I got really into Captain Planet too. That's why I'm a Planeteer, and focused a lot on that. I knew I wanted to go into environmental studies, but I didn't know what exactly I wanted to do by the time I got into college. But my love of understanding how hurricanes worked really superseded everything once we got hit with, I think the hurricane was Hurricane Irene in 2011. It had passed over the Bahamas and it followed me to Connecticut for like my first year of undergraduate. And I was like, okay, that's weird. And then Hurricane Sandy occurred like the next year. Superstorm Sandy occurred the next year. And I was just like, okay, so hurricanes happen up here and also they can turn into snowstorms. I need to know more about these things. So I took a class on ocean and atmosphere climate modeling. At the time, it was really cool, but I was doing a geology major, which made it kind of difficult to focus on this topic. I mean, I love rocks rock, but it wasn't what I wanted to do. So in 2014, I got a scholarship internship with NOAA, Geophysical Fluids and Dynamics Laboratory in Princeton, New Jersey. Worked there for a bit, started my undergraduate thesis with the folks working there, and I had not turned back since then.
So can you tell us a little bit about your current role and what being an atmospheric scientist means to you?
Oh, sure. So I've been working here at the Cape Eleuthera Institute for about a year and some change now. When I came here, I am one of the first marine scientists here who did not focus on biology. So the work I do focuses more on ocean and atmosphere interactions, weather, and physical oceanography. So the partnership that we have with NOAA and the University of Miami basically involves us using a glider, which is like this huge, expensive, small, mini submarine that goes into the ocean and takes sea surface and sea surface temperature and salinity measurements. And the idea is if a hurricane passes over, we could see a change in sea surface temperature and salinity to get an idea of like how the thermal exchange works, and also to take that same data and put it into the National Weather Service's coupled climate models to make for better predictions. And, you know, in the wake of Hurricane Dorian that hit the Bahamas in 2019, this was a really huge project. And also because I am a hurricane expert in my own right, they hired me on for this project to work on that, also to teach this to students from all ages. So here I teach a research class for high school students. I also work with students in the local community, so primary school students, high school students. We have a middle school that we work with that involves students from the island of Eleuthera. and do some weather research climate work with them and also our primary school students. I also focus on a climate change awareness campaign, which I've been pushing for about a year now, trying to get folks' perceptions on climate change in the country. It's modeled after one of my mentors, Dr. Del Thomas, and her collaborator at the time, Dr. Lisa Benjamin. Their work's looking at how Bahamians see climate change. And my other source of research also is looking at how hurricanes are going to be affected by climate change in the near future. So looking at projections, data, and comparing how hurricanes in this particular region are going to be affected by the worst case climate change scenario, which would be if we got up to, I think it's 8.5 watts per meter, 8.5 watts, I think. Someone will correct me.
Marjahn, that's super interesting. Could you clear up some stuff for me? Because I am absolutely clueless about hurricanes, except the fact that hurricane season is pretty much between mid-August through mid-October. So with the work that you're doing and looking at hurricanes in relation to climate change, what are you all finding out so far, or what are you seeing in the data? Can we expect to see longer hurricane periods or windows of activities? Are we expecting to see stronger? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So when it comes to hurricanes and climate change, it's like a huge, there are a bunch of questions folks have normally that involve it. And when studying it, you kind of have to look at, of course, frequency, how many hurricanes are going to hit, how intense are the hurricanes going to be, what does this mean for the external factors that affect hurricanes, what are the different things that we need to know. So what we've been focusing on so far in our studies is we found that when the sea surface increases, right? So this is an environmental factor that affects whether hurricanes develop, how intense they'll get, and all these other things. What we see is that with the increase of sea surface temperature, hurricanes, sea surface temperature actually acts like the fuel for hurricanes, right? So if it's really, really hot, you get more intense storms from that. But with the salinity factor, that's something that we don't really talk about, right? So a lot of studies with hurricanes have been focused more on the atmosphere only component. So how does the relative humidity make a difference? How do we see if there's difference in vertical wind shear? These things that have huge effects on hurricanes. But with the sea surface salinity, so how much salt is in the ocean, if there's more salt in the ocean at the time, then the salt actually acts as a barrier for evaporation, which makes it harder for the heat, latent heat, and moisture to leave and add to the storm, convective clouds, which makes the storm more intense. So we see that if we have less salinity in an area and more hot temperatures, that we should get more intense storms in that region. One of the big factors with hurricane seasons, for this hurricane season, actually 2022, they're predicting so far that we're going to have more intense storms. And they've been predicting more intense storms, I think, since I think from my memory, since I started researching about 2014, that's been the prediction. What that means basically is that it's not that we're going to get more frequent hurricanes, but we are going to get a higher proportion of more dangerous ones, so more major hurricanes, which would be considered category 3, 4, and 5. So what that would mean is back if in 2009, right? In 2009, if there had been 15 named storms predicted, and out of those 15, you expect to get 2 major storms, that would have been a normal thing for 2009. In 2022, if we had the same 15 storms, range from 14, 16, with the same kind of 15 storms, we'd expect to see possibly 7 or 8 major hurricanes compared to the 2.
That's pretty incredible and a little bit scary. So what does the future hold for places like the Caribbean? Do you think that we have some kind of natural resilience? We've lived through many hurricane seasons. Do you think that experience kind of bodes well for our future, or are we kind of veering off into unfamiliar and unpredictable territory?
Okay, Ron, listen. So one of the issues, right, what we have with this is places in the Caribbean have been resilient for so long, right? So take, for example, Hurricane Dorian. Part of the reason we had so many people affected by the storm is because they we knew what it was like in this country to ride like a hurricane, like a category 5. We knew what that was like. There was no like fear of like, okay, this is coming, it's not that big a deal. When it actually hit, no one had predicted, like the wind was one thing. The wind increased at such a fast pace, no one had seen that coming. That was one thing that wasn't expected. The other thing was also the flooding, right? So with sea level rise, we're actually seeing it. We actually saw the effects of flooding in the areas like in Grand Bahama and Abaco. We saw more flooding. And then there's also intense rain to look out for. So one of the things that I believe it was James Cosin who actually did this study, basically focusing on how we are actually seeing a translational slowdown of storms. So relative to, I think, 1979, storms have been, in this study, he's basically showing, he and a bunch of his team members were showing that the storms have actually been slowing down for the past couple of decades. And with that slowdown, storms have also become more intense with rain. So you're seeing more precipitation as well, and more evaporation, water cycle, more evaporation, more precipitation, more convective like systems. And as we get the slowdown, that means that the rain rate, basically like the speed of the storms and the intensity of rain, is adding to that flooding even more. So you have sea level rise, you have these slower storms, you have this intense rainfall, and you have winds possibly picking up. And we're still categorizing hurricanes as like categorizing them by wind speed versus all these other factors that make a huge difference. So my answer to your question with saying all that is that where we once were resilient, we're now looking out for different factors that we hadn't experienced or expected before. Like the Bahamas is a low-lying country. So now the sea level rise, we're actually seeing that with these storms and with storm surge, it's getting more intense than we had anticipated before.
Wow, my mind is literally blown, pun intended, because I love a good earth science pun. But now I have so many other questions for you because I think about our various islands, especially in the Caribbean. And the reason I'm kind of defaulting to Caribbean is because we're all Caribbean on this episode. I think about how many of us lie below sea level, Bahamas, Guyana, just to name a few, the sea walls we have in place and what that means, and the term resiliency that you're using. But I also think about the fact that after a while, resiliency, like you said, isn't enough, especially when things start escalating or elevating or becoming more dangerous. And I think about refugee and leaving and immigration and emigration and what that means and what that looks like. So it brings me to the term or the label climate refugee. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that and how your work may or may not intersect, or your thoughts on the labeling or the fact that this is a thing that will eventually happen. It's been happening, but climate change deniers are denouncing it. Can you care to take me in any direction from that?
Oh yeah, everywhere. I think I'd mentioned that before, and like we talked about it, where we were discussing how I did not like that terminology, climate refugee. And I think the reason that was, thinking back, was because it kind of implies like this is a thing that, like, climate is a thing that is happening to people, and it is making like folks refugees. And what bothers me is that there is no responsibility for the thing that is happening. And the people who are going to be most affected, the people who are most affected, most specifically, those of us who are on small island developing states in the Caribbean, those of us in Black and Brown communities, those of us who are in intersections of all three of those things, we are going to be affected the most by this thing. And we are being affected the most right now. Like we're experiencing hotter summers, we're experiencing hotter nights, we're experiencing more like drought and all these other things that's happening right now, and it's only projected to get worse, right? So we're experiencing all these things, and it's like we're at the mercy of the climate, but we are not receiving the assistance. That's where I'm having a lot of issue, I think, with the terminology, because yes, these are climate refugees, and you look at folks like, for example, right? So when, like, bringing it back to hurricanes. So Hurricane Maria, I think it was Irma that hit, Hurricane Maria and Irma hit the same year. And you had folks in Puerto Rico who were really, really badly affected. You had folks in the Bahamas who were badly affected, the Turks and Caicos. Fortunately for folks who were in the southern parts of the Bahamas, they were able to migrate, right? So they were able to migrate to different parts of the country, and some people to family members, I suppose, in Florida. With Dorian, it was the same thing. People were able to migrate, but the issue is they can't migrate back home because a lot of the time, there's no funding to try to fix the places back or like support people. Like you're already dealing with people who are in a situation where they probably do not have much or do not have the support to maintain a particular lifestyle as it is. So when some disaster like this happens and there's no support coming from internal government or coming from like international places, it becomes even harder. And I mean, I think part of the issue that I had with climate refugee describing like the migration is the refugee terminology is really hitting a lot of us who are a particular skin color, right? It doesn't necessarily address, and for obvious reasons, right? A lot of us are like in certain areas, like different parts of Africa will be facing like huge droughts, lots of heat waves and things like that, more intense rainfall that's hitting different parts of the continent. And part of the reason is because there are no resources that have been set up in the past, right? With colonization, there hasn't been a lack of resources to have people able to better prepare for it. And I'm not sure whether or not that's me going on a tangent of blame, but also like thinking about like I could even say from my grad school experience when I was at the University of Leeds, and they talk a lot about the work that they did on the continent of Africa. And because they don't have any weather stations set up there, they don't have any data there, they don't have all these other things. And it's kind of like, and why do they have so much set up in South America? Well, there was a bit of colonization that happened, and we put a bow tie on that when we talk about the colonization aspects of us going into South America and setting up what we needed to set up and going into those communities, whether they asked for it or not, whether or not in present day we educate the people who are deemed most worthy to come from these countries, and then whether or not we encourage them to go back or give them the tools they need. It's like, what I could appreciate about the researchers I worked with in Leeds, though, is that they recognized that there was an issue there. So they're trying to rectify as much as they possibly could. But I think I'm going on a tangent for sure. But one of the issues that you can see, and it's like blatantly obvious, is just like the fact that we are reckoning. And I mean, a lot of this with climate justice and all of it with climate change in general is we're reckoning with this fact that the history stands that because which could have been colonization or like setting up a particular thing in this region and like stealing resources from people happened back when, as a result of that, B is that people are at a loss, suffering, and then like they're at a loss, they have less, they have to make do with what they have, and then C, they have to migrate. And half the times they migrate out of country, it's a lot harder to get where they need to go. So why do we, like that's where I struggle with the terminology, because it's not at the fault of folks who do have to migrate. And it is an issue that we have to adapt to the current changing climate. But how we got to this place without acknowledging the fact that this history had to get here and bring us to this place is where I have a lot of issue with it, if that makes sense to you guys.
No, Marjahn, it absolutely makes sense. And I just want to reassure you that you have not gone on a tangent. When we talk about earth science, environmental science, climate, atmospheric, everything that falls under the umbrella geoscience, we really need to understand that science, human rights, and social justice, they all intersect. And there are some uncomfortable conversations that we really need to start having openly and respectfully if we really want to genuinely mitigate and inform as we move forward, especially with these global crises. So no, you're not on a tangent. I am literally here supporting you and rooting for you. I love that your work also focuses on women X and non-binary and Caribbean folks on top of everything else. I love the inclusivity and the accessibility within your science. Thoughts, Dr. Prince? I'm like blown away right now.
Yeah, we love tangents here. And that really kind of fits in with a conversation I was having with one of my classes this week about kind of how climate change is affecting us here in Florida. I use the term climate refugee. I know that when we use the term refugee, a particular set of people come into mind that most times happen to be brown or black in this part of the world. So it's easy for us to dismiss. I tell them that even here in the US right now, we are kind of already seeing the effects of people being displaced because of climate change. And I use California as an example. Like, there are lots of people that are leaving California, and climate change is kind of exacerbating that. We see they're in the midst of a historic drought that seems to have no end in sight, that leads to an increase in wildfires, and people pack up and leave. And where do they go? Well, I just moved here from Texas, and there's a steady stream of Californians moving to places like Austin, Texas, and you're already starting to see the social impacts of that movement of people. So housing prices in Austin have shot up tremendously. You have people that live in Austin that can't afford to live there anymore. And we're just going to have that domino effect. So here in Florida, I always think about the Caribbean, and us dealing with hurricanes and hurricanes intensifying. Where are all Caribbean brethren going to go? All right, they're going to go a lot of times where they have links and family members, and Florida has a huge Caribbean population. So we'll start to see more pressure on the resources here. And I try to really drive that point home that, yeah, you might hear like temperatures may increase by 1.5 degrees if we're lucky, more if we're not. You have to think beyond that temperature change and think about the ways that our planet, the dynamism of our planet, how that's going to affect all of these other things. But I did hear you mention in there that a lot of times the communities that get most impacted aren't the ones that are driving the emissions that are leading to climate change. Is that something that you can explore in a little more detail for us?
Oh, absolutely. One of the issues that we have with climate change emissions, right? It's just, I think I read actually today in the latest Working Group 3 IPCC report that it's like the same 18 countries who've had like a steady increase of emissions, and like 18 out of 200 plus, like imagine. So what we have is a situation where we have nations like ours in the Caribbean that do not have that big, if you will, carbon footprint compared to these other big nations, right? So one of them being like, of course, the US. So like the US, China, I believe, different parts of Europe, basically like a lot of countries in global north, and also some nations that I think China is also considered in that group, having all this manufacturing happening, having like big emissions due to transport, manufacturing, oil and gas thriving, all these things that they're doing. And countries like ours in the Caribbean, in large parts of the continent of Africa, different parts of South America, that are highly affected. And one of the things that is big on that, right, is going back to like COP26 that just happened. Now, one of the big campaigns that scientists in the Caribbean in particular, and other small island developing states, right, because outside of the Caribbean, you have like places in the Pacific Ocean, like islands in the Pacific Ocean that are literally experiencing like sea level rise as they walk. Do you know what I mean? Like you have small places, like one of the smallest like global footprints comes from like this island called Tuvalu, like the country all the way on the other side that has barely any footprints, like has barely any emissions that go up. What happened is we started this campaign that goes back, I believe, from the last the COP meeting that happened. It's the hashtag 1.5 to stay alive. I got wind of this hashtag, I think last March, when I'd attended a conference with one of the top professors in climate science and modeling, Professor Michael Taylor at University of West Indies. And he was basically bringing up how important it is that we in the Caribbean are pushing for 1.5 to stay alive. We need to get up to 1.5 degrees. Like that's the highest we can with emissions to stay alive, not necessarily to thrive. I want to highlight that. For us to stay alive, for us to not sink, for us to not experience these high impact weather extremes, for us to not deal with these intensified hurricanes that we're probably still gonna have to deal with. But to see less of that, to have a control, to have a cap, we need to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius, leave it at that. With the last COP26, negotiations took us to globally agreeing on 2.7 degrees Celsius. Now, we said we need 1.5 to stay alive. Folks said, okay, we hear you, we feel you. 2.7 is what we're willing to do because we're not really willing to part ways with dealing with fossil fuels just yet. We are willing to part with coal. We're not willing to part with oil and gas just yet. And you see like things online where like, the UK government, though they pledged to drop emissions, they would still be backing a lot of oil and gas companies. And you have like these students out about who would protest basically in the climate crisis, because that's what we're in, a climate crisis, and getting shut down by governments and things like that. And it's just, what's interesting now too, is that we have the carbon crediting system that basically is giving these companies and these governments more allowance to continue doing the oil and gas thing and the emissions thing, and buying carbon credits from countries like in the Caribbean to do more more environmental work to try to greenwash this whole issue. But it's just, it's a lot. It's crazy. Every other day I'm wowed and amazed by the lack of understanding we have of climate change, but also just like how willing folks are not to part ways with the way things work.
I am so glad you said that last sentence about lack of understanding, because it kind of brings me, I have two questions for you. And one of them, I definitely want to retouch on human rights and climate. But the first question before we advance, I want to ask you if you wouldn't mind using plain language, dialing it back for our audience, and briefly explaining the difference between everyday weather and climate change. Because one of the things I'm coming across with doing some of my community engagement and SciComm is how confused people are by certain terminology or how much wrong information there's available. Because I have people saying like, well, why don't people just move, or why don't they better prepare for the weather? And I realize that they've confused the two terms.
Yes. So weather and climate. Okay, so all of these things are atmospheric conditions that happen. Like they're in the atmosphere, they happen in a certain layer that we live in, the tropospheric layer. So when we talk about weather, it's just the day-to-day conditions. So Monday, it could be hot, Tuesday, it could be cold, Wednesday, it could be windy. You probably live in England. That's the weather. It's just constantly, it changes every day. That's the weather. Temperature is different every day. Every hour you might expect, like 1 hour might be rain, 1 hour it won't be. That's the weather, constantly changing. Climate is basically looking at the long-term conditions of the atmosphere. So it can be looking at different components of the weather to get you an idea of like what the climate is like. So if I say on Monday it's raining, that's me talking about the weather. When I'm talking about like in the Bahamas, in Trinidad, it's normally very hot and humid. That's because over a couple of months or like maybe throughout the year, we've seen this consistently throughout like on average, we've seen this consistently throughout those nations, right? So looking at their atmospheric conditions for this amount of time and different parts of like, and this, the climate matters geographically, it matters with weather. So like Trinidad and the Bahamas are closer to the equator than somewhere like Connecticut, USA, where we'd see like hot and humid conditions, whereas in Connecticut, you might see like more temperate, saying like it's easier for this kind of tree to grow here versus in the Bahamas, it's harder for this kind of tree because the climate is different. So it gives you an idea of like how the climate should normally be stable and be in that place. When we talk about climate change, we're talking about the change of this normally like constant condition that we experience in these areas. So with climate change, what's happening is we normally look at the global mean surface temperature, measuring changes, right? So what's happening right now is the Earth is warming up. So that leads us to talk about global warming. The reason that's happening is because of greenhouse gas emissions, those being carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and a few others. But I'll focus on carbon dioxide because that's the main thing that we talk about. What's happened is the Earth is normally surrounded by this blanket of greenhouse gas, like the greenhouse blanket, I like to call it. That is a bunch of gases that are just up in the atmosphere. And basically what happens is heat comes from the sun, and that heat is absorbed some by the land and others is reflected back off. When it reflects back, it normally will hit some of the greenhouse blankets surrounding the Earth, and that will be absorbed in the Earth. Some of the heat will escape back to space, but a lot of it stays in. Without this greenhouse blanket, we would die because everything would be cold. So it's necessary that it's there in order to sustain life on Earth. However, as greenhouse gas emissions, like we have a natural greenhouse blanket that's there normally, that comes from normal like decomposition of things to give you more carbon dioxide in the air, and methane, and very normal things that would have happened before the industrial complex in the 1850s, which again is something to talk about when you go into climate justice, because think about who was doing industry in 1850. As you see, the carbon dioxide increased over time, like emissions increased over time with more industry, more carbon dioxide got trapped inside the greenhouse blanket. As a result of that, you have these holes in the blanket that heat was able to escape from, closing up, which makes it harder for heat to leave, which means that more of that heat is absorbed on Earth. So that's why we see a change in global warming throughout the planet. And that's what we talk about when we talk about climate change, because as there's more heat, we see more changes in our weather patterns, right? We see issues with like currents that move over the ocean. We see issues with just the ocean itself absorbing more heat than it normally should be absorbing. And again, like one of my favorite examples, obviously, is the hurricane intensification, because if there's more heat on the ocean, that means that there's more heat at the sea surface. And if there's more heat at the sea surface, that means that there's more fuel for hurricanes to form or intensify or get stronger. So it's a big effect in that way.
I know that you're really into community engagement and education. Can you share some of the ways that your respective institutions or even governments have been working to reach out to our communities?
I can't speak too much on the government work. I know for a fact, recently we had an election in September that just passed, where we had a new government in power. And both government before and this one, we're taking environment more seriously. This government has worked to implement a climate change office in the office of the Prime Minister. So they've been working on things that involve carbon crediting and more policy regarding climate change, which is good. At our institution, at Cape Luther Institute, we've worked to engage with the local community more, and also the rest of the Bahamas, really. I also work with international scientists and groups, so I do my best to bring what I learned from them into the community, into the island school community, but also to the community in Luther and Bahamas. So what we've done, one of the big things that we do here, we have a sustainability team that works on like farming practices. So permaculture is a big thing that we've started, I think in November, got really involved in. Food security is huge, and also focusing on like understanding how climate change works. So we try to integrate those things as much as possible. One of the things that we've collaborated on is pushing for folks to do less buying of things, so thrifting more. We started an eco swap meet that is now going to be a community fair. We're really excited in our local community of Deep Creek, Eleuthera, trying to see if folks can bring in clothes and books and items that they have in their house that they're not using, and see, like, just leave it out there for people to take. Basically have like a little free drive for people to come in, see stuff, take it, give things a new home, but we want it to be a more fun event for people to come out to. So we're working on that now. I'm also applying for a grant where we're going to see if we could do some more work with actual climate education throughout the country, working with teachers to try to break down the climate change language as much as possible. We did a study, like I mentioned before, focusing on Bahamian understanding of the perceptions of climate change. And me and my research technician, Zoe Brown, have been looking at how to best serve the community with this information, right? So we can see where there are gaps where people don't understand certain terminology. So rather than, this is what actually one of my friends was talking to me about this the other day. How do we best come to a community and ask them what they need versus me going to the community and telling everyone, you don't understand climate change and this is what y'all need to know. So we're trying to take the balanced information that we have while also humbly coming to communities and asking folks, what do you want to know and how can we help you bridge the gap that you need to build a better understanding for this thing. So that's something that we are trying to implement in all of our work really down at Cape Luther Institute.
Wow. I mean, this has been such a great conversation. I mean, Marjahn, you've taken us through such amazing technical storytelling. And I mean, we've covered so many things. We've covered what you're working on, your passion, how you got here, our thoughts on how it impacts underrepresented communities, but why this is everyone's problem and what we should do. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and take you down our random route of hot potato, which is how we like to close off our segment, so that not only do our listeners get to know our guests scientifically or technically, but they also get to know a little bit of personal. So you are Bahamian, and with that in mind, I am going to kick off my first hot potato question for you by asking you, which is your favorite, conch salad, chicken foot sauce, or I totally forgot my third one. I lost it. Oh my God.
I was so nervous too. I was like, oh my gosh, what's she gonna say?
Totally
Was it fire engine?
Fire engine, thank you. Oh my gosh. I can you tell I'm a conch salad lover? I just got distracted once I said conch salad.
Fire engine, absolutely. I would fight people for that. I grew up with like 4 younger siblings, and my mother used to make that often because it was affordable, and it was 5 of us, and she had to be fast, and that used to keep us going. That's my answer.
All right, next up. Who has the better beaches? Bahamas, Cuba, or Turks and Caicos?
I heard that there was a myth that it was Turks and Caicos, but I can guarantee definitely the Bahamas. We have a lot of land, so therefore that's the truth.
Wow, no bias at all, huh?
None, absolutely not.
And last but not least, what is in your Netflix queue right now?
Oh my God, what am I watching? That is a good question. The Witcher. The Witcher, yes. The Witcher. Did I watch anything else? I feel like I was trying to watch that show where The Ultimatum. It is so bad. I cannot. I keep trying to read. It's so bad. So toxic.
Yeah, I haven't even, I'm not even about to attempt to watch it, but I mean, at least you survived hot potato.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Marjahn, for taking the time to talk with us today, educate us all on climate change and kind of thinking of all the ways that it affects all of us so differently. But thank you for bringing that focus to the Caribbean for us. We definitely appreciated hearing your perspective. So are there any platforms that you would like people to follow you or learn about your work? This is your opportunity to share those with us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you guys for having me again. Really happy to be here. You can follow me at Marjahn F. That's MarjahnnF on Instagram and Twitter. And also you can follow CEI Bahamas on Twitter. And I believe we're also on Instagram and Cape Luther Institute on Facebook to see what I'm doing and what my team is doing.